I should go to university. There's this huge correspondence between them. And my father, I'd been away too long, actually. They wanted me back home. And so she pushed my father to allow me to go to a secretarial college in London. So the age of 18, which is very rare in the 1960s, I lived alone in London in a hostel. And because of my best friend, who was left school and become a ballet dancer, we were always going to plays, we were going to theater, we were going to music, every concert that was on, Leonard Bernstein, all these people, we went and heard the Oistrachs, and Yehudi Menuhin. I even got Yehudi Menuhin's autograph. I was obsessed with music. And then I come home to Pakistan. And again, I'm out on a limb. Not a world that I know. So then I start reading V.S. Naipaul, I start reading Ahmad Ali, and I get to know people like Adrian Hussein and Kaleem Umar, and they're all reciting poetry. And suddenly the world that I inhabited is being transmuted into English. But I really started writing after my marriage. As my friend Nahid here, she also encouraged me. She knew that I was interested in writing, and there was Naz, and Naz actually said to me, "You've always been interested in writing, you're not doing anything now, why don't you write?" Then I discovered this thing of what my Aunt Athiya said to you, that it's like a muscle that you have to keep exercising. When I started writing, I was a bit shocked because I couldn't write as I had done while I was at school, because I hadn't written for so many years. So then I start reading, throwing away, writing. And at some point, well, actually, then Summer, my daughter, because you were used to me typing away, and I was not getting published anyway. I was too nervous. I never told anybody. And I tried writing fiction also. That didn't get anywhere. And so this went on for years. And someone actually at school wrote in an essay, a school essay, what your mothers do. I mean, she wrote, "My mother is a writer." And her teacher crossed it out and said, "Your mother is a housewife." And then Naz also came along and said, "Look, this is ridiculous. You've got to start getting published." And
I want to quote my sister's other line. Can I?
yes, quote it. I don't remember it.
Yes, you can remember it. My sister said to my mother, when Alexander the Great was 33, he'd conquered half the world, and you haven't written a book yet.
Oh.
which I think must have been a good incentive.
Well, luckily I don't remember that. So then my career actually began in complete nepotism, because my cousin, who was a film director called Waris Hussain, his films had been shown in Karachi. He was the youngest TV director in the BBC. When he was 24, he did A Passage to India and whatnot. But by the time
for those who care about these things, which is me, he directed the first ever episode of Doctor Who.
Yes, he did.
There we go.
Yes, he did. And he won the BAFTA award for Edward and Mrs. Simpson. He just won the BAFTA award, but over here, his films, Henry VIII and his wives, had been shown, and another film of his being shown, and everybody here in the papers and thinking, "Who's this chap called Waris Hussain?" There were all sort of stupid articles on who he might be. So I thought, this is nonsense. So I went to London and said, "Waris, will you give me an interview?" And he gave me an interview, and that interview got published in the Morning News. And then it sort of went on from the Morning News, and then one morning I contributed to Dawn. I actually wrote to Dawn on Dawn. It was my article on Princess Sarwat, my interview with Princess Sarwat. And in the morning, Zubaida Mustafa rang me up and said, "Will you write for us?" And I was so bowled over, I nearly fell off the bed, off the chair. I mean, I just couldn't. So that's how my career began. And then Mr. Siddiqui, who was my editor, they just started the magazine supplement, he discovered I liked reading. And he started pushing me into literary interviews. So then I had a jolly good time, because I did Hanif Qureshi when he came here in 1982. And there was Deborah Moga, who was posted here for a while. Then I thought, this is very exciting. Then I went on holidays to England. I'd started writing to all these people. So I interviewed Doris Lessing, I interviewed Harry Keating. And so I had a great time. And so that's really, it's a bit long-winded, I'm sorry. Okay. Now I have to ask you a question.
I think this is how it works.
Yeah, because you said that, you heard me typing, so thought it was a career. But that time, when I was hammering away on a typewriter, I wasn't actually doing anything. I mean, I wasn't getting published. But you then decide at the age of 9 or something you want to be a writer. How did this come about?
So when you're very young, adults have an annoying way of saying to people, even when they're 5 or 6 or 7, and what are you going to do when you grow up? Which I think we should stop saying to children, frankly. It's a ridiculous question to
Yes.
ask. But I was asked it all the time, and the only thing I knew that I loved was reading. You know, for me, for many years of my life, probably from the age of sort of 7 till 12 or so, when I started to read longer books, a day was marked by reading a whole book in it. So every day I would read one book. And I would finish a book and I'd have to immediately go and find the next book I was going to read. It was almost like a safety blanket that I would have to decide, well, tomorrow it's this one, and I'd go and find it and physically touch it. So reading was the great passion of my life. But as far as I knew then, because I was 9, you couldn't grow up to be a reader. That sounded silly. So when people said, what are you going to do? I'd just say, writer, because I had a mother who wrote. And I had a great aunt who'd published. So writer didn't seem ridiculous. When I said it at 9, though, I don't think at that point I really deeply felt I want to be a writer. I just knew I loved novels. And for me, that was the novel in the English language. And then when I was 11, a very strange thing happened. I was at my grandparents' house, my Nani and Nana's, and as my mother said, my grandfather's library, it was full of books, but it was full of books that at 11 I had absolutely no interest in. Some of them were Greek, some of them were Latin, and then there was, Marx and Engels and German Mao and the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, and, really no interest. And I was looking around one day in his study, and there was a hardback book with a blue cover and gold writing, and it said, "All dogs go to heaven." And I pulled it out and I started to read it, and we'd had a pet dog who had died, which was the first loss of my life. And so I read this book, and I started weeping, and it was wonderful. And then my mother came to say, we have to go home now, but I was only halfway through this book. So I said to my grandfather, can I borrow this? And he looked at it and he said, I've never seen this book before. I have no idea what it is. It's yours. So I took it home and I wept some more. And the next day or a few days later, my best friend, Asad, came over. And Asad and I, one of the things that was very important in our friendship was we were both great readers, and we would read a book and we'd swap it back and forth. And I said, you have to read this book. He had also had a pet dog who died. And I said, you have to read this book. And he said, and he still doesn't know what made him say this. Or every now and then I've asked him, he said, I don't even remember that moment the way you do. He said, why don't we write a book? We were 11 years old. This was Karachi in 1984. As you remember, there wasn't a lot to do. If you were a child in Karachi, you would read, you would write. When cricket was on, you would watch cricket. But otherwise, it was a bit of a wasteland. So writing a book seemed like a nice way of passing some time. So we started to write, and we would write a few pages and hand it to the other. But here's the really curious part of it. Some months went by, and I said, can I have that novel back? I want to read it. And he said, what novel? I said, the one I gave you, my grandfather's book, All Dogs Go to Heaven. And he said, you never gave it to me. He said, you spoke about it, and then we started to write our own book, and you never gave that to me, and I keep meaning to ask you for it. And I never saw it again. So I don't know where it came from, how it appeared in my grandfather's study, and I don't know where it went.
Oh, wow.
But because of this book, and then I just kept on writing, and my mother said, if you're really serious about this, you should write on your own to develop your own voice. And I just kept writing through school, and it was, by the time I was about 15, I remember one day having a very clear feeling of, if I don't do this, in this slightly dramatic 15-year-old way, if I don't do this, I won't be happy. And I went to university in America, to Hamilton College in upstate New York, and in one of the great, great acts of fortune that can land in a life, it was a college on a hill, in a village, in the snow belt, 5 hours from everywhere, only 1,600 students, but among the people who were there was the great, great Kashmiri poet Agha Shahid Ali, who became my teacher, my mentor, my friend, and was enormously important then in my sort of development as a writer and how seriously I started to take writing. And also to have someone like Shahid say, yeah, you're good, you can do this, I think made me feel for the first time this is not just some silly kind of dream, that I might actually have what it takes, whatever that is, to follow this. Um, but I want to go back to you now because we sort of there's sort of interesting parallel trajectories that happen because I was working on my so I go through undergrad and then I went to graduate school, again for creative writing because Agha Shahid Ali moved to teach in the MFA program for creative writing in the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and said to me, you should apply here. So I applied and I got in. And so right out of my undergraduate, I went to the University of Massachusetts. And while I was there, there was a writers' conference, which was at Hamilton College, which I just graduated from. But one of the professors there said to me, you should come. There are a lot of literary agents and publishers coming from America, and there's one coming from the UK. There's an agent, I think she'll like your work. I'm going to show her something you wrote. So I went along, I was 21, and I'd written this 4-page short story. And the agent, whose name was Alexandra Pringle, had a whole bunch of stories, and she liked mine the best. And so she spent a lot of time talking about my story, which meant everyone else in the room hated me because she didn't talk about their work. But she talked about how much she liked mine, so that gave me the confidence afterwards to go up to her. And I didn't know very much about her, but I knew from her bio that she was one of the founding editors, or the early editors of Virago, the feminist press in London. And for lack of something else to say, because I'm a Desi and we find family connections where we can, I said, oh, you used to work at Virago. My great aunt was published as a Virago Modern Classics. And she said, who's your great aunt? And I said, her name was Atiya Hussain. And this English woman looked at me and said, I published those books. And then she said, I really believe in connections like this. I love that short story of yours. Turn it into a novel and send it to me. It was a 4-page short story. I turned it into the novel In the City by the Sea. She was my agent on it. She helped me rework it and become a publishable thing. And then she sold it to Granta. She sold it to Granta in 1997, which was an important year because that was the year Dragonfly in the Sun came out.
Yeah, that's right.
I want you to tell us how that, because, my mother will never say this, so I'll say it for her. She is, I think without question, has been for many years the world's leading expert on Pakistan Anglophone writing. And I would make the argument that, in fact, she created the awareness of that as a category. And I think that started with A Dragonfly in the Sun, before which, we were talking yesterday about Bapsi Sitwa and how, for many of us, Bapsi Sitwa was the only writer writing in English. So can you talk about A Dragonfly in the Sun and how that got you onto a path that then led to hybrid tapestries and other things?
Well, I'm going to go to Dragonfly in the Sun, but your conversation, the thing about Alexandra Pringle, I have to go back a little bit in time, is, my aunt Atiya had published Sunlight on a Broken Column and Phoenix Fled in about the early 60s. And then it was praised, but for a long time there was a huge silence about this. And then one day she rang me, terribly excited. I happened to be in London, and she said, do you know, Virago rang me. And they said, would I mind if they reprinted my novel? And she said, would I mind? And so they reprinted her novel, and later I discovered that was Alexandra Pringle who had approached her. But the other interesting thing is that after Alexandra met Kamila, she wrote to my aunt Atiya, who wrote to me. She said, I've had this wonderful letter from my ex-publisher. And she said, I went to this college and I saw a whole lot of stories. And there was one which was exceptional from a young woman who says she's your great niece. Isn't that wonderful? So there was these kind of, and Auntie Atiya also encouraged her. So, but to go back to Dragonfly in the Sun, well, what happened was that by the early 1980s, South Asian English literature had started gathering a sort of, it was always there, but, the British had marginalized it, and some it was Achibi's book, some famous academic had said, oh, this is not literature, this is anthropology and this kind of rubbish, which, mind you, was a narrative that carried on here because we used these old-fashioned books for a very long time. And so Indian English literature was making a big headway. You had Anita Desai, you had Salman, you had various people. And everybody kept saying to me, oh, there's so many Indians writing in English, why aren't there any Pakistanis? Well, I was interviewing them all the time because of Dawn. I was being, I not only did Hanif, there was Rukhsana Ahmed came, I interviewed Rukhsana, I went to London, I attended conferences, I met Amir Hussain, I met all sorts of people, and they were all writing. So it was OUP. It was Amina Sayyed who was in charge of OUP then, and they told me that they were bringing out these Golden Jubilee books, and would I contribute? I thought there would be just, and I thought, no, let's do a retrospective, in a chronological order, because, literature doesn't begin on a certain date. It doesn't begin in 1947. I mean, Ahmad Ali became famous in 1940. Shahid Surawardi became famous in 1930. Well, he was famous even before that. So I then started doing it in a chronological order according to birth. And as I was writing this, I went on discovering more and more writers. I had no idea there was a large number of English language writers in America. I was introduced to them by Professor Memon, Tahira Naqvi, Muazzam Sheikh. But the thing was, in those days, it was still difficult. As Babsi once said, when she was trying to get her first book published, they said, oh, well, this place is too remote. We can't publish this book. No one's heard of this kind of thing. We became well known later, unfortunately, because of the geopolitics in Western, that's another story. So I then started collecting material, and I ended up with 44 writers of Pakistani origin. One of the things I did, and this is partly also because of my own education in England, I knew the whole thing of duality, of when you have one culture but another culture lingers within you, your relatives or your friends or so on. And so it emerges in your writing. And I remember a lot of, and even now, people still complain, why do you include Hanif Qureshi? He goes around saying he's British. Well, he is British. But he is the nephew of Maki Qureshi. He's the nephew of Umar Qureshi. He writes books about them. He writes about how his father, Rafiun Shah An Qureshi, was a writer. They're all very much a part of, not only a part of himself, but when he's asked to contribute to a book on Pakistani literature, he's very pleased. So I included Hanif. I included America-based writers. Anyway, the bottom line was I got 44 writers of Pakistani origin in that book. And the book actually did very well. And when I left a book at my Aunt Atiya's house, and the academic Ranjana Ash turned up. And she saw this book, and she said, what's this book? I didn't know so many Pakistanis wrote in English. And she promptly spoke to me, and she rang up SOAS, and I was then sent off to SOAS to give a talk on Pakistani English literature, and that sort of began my sort of links with the academic world alongside my work as a literary journalist.
I want to talk about the difference with the kinds of books we grew up with, because by the time I was, reading fiction that was for older readers, it was the 80s. And you were reading all this stuff, so it was very natural for me, age 14 or 15, to be reading Anita Desai, to be reading Kazuo Ishiguro, to be reading Chinua Achebe, to be reading V.S. Naipaul, to be reading Babsi Sitwa. And it wasn't to me in any way a surprising thing that writers could have names that were not Smith and Jones. And I know for you it was different. And I know this is going back, but we mentioned Atiya Hussain a few times here. Her books came out when you were in England. I'm very interested in that. What was it like to have someone in 1950 1953, 1962, a woman with the name Atya Hussain publishing in London. Did you, how did that feel?
Nothing. Guess what? I mean, I don't remember Phoenix Fled because I was very little then, but when Sunlight on a Broken Column came out, I mean, our family was so excited. Our family was so excited in Karachi and, elsewhere. And I remember I went back to school, and this was a different English teacher, mind you, another English teacher, who came along, and my sister and I were obviously trying to talk about it. And this woman looks at me, and she said, "What is this novel that you and your sister keep talking about? I've never heard of it." And that was the end of that. So I never really associated it with myself as something new or something. Well, there was an aunt who'd written there's a book that interested me, but I never talked about these things.
You said years ago when I was at university and I was reading Orientalism for the first time, and you said, I remember when I read that it was so important because these were things that I had been aware of and hadn't seen them put in words before.
Yeah. Well, I was very aware of the colonial construct and the way the way they spoke about literature and language and. But good God, can you imagine sitting in an English school and they're learning history and saying to them, "Excuse me, my relatives were executed for mutiny"? I mean, can you imagine? They would say, "Oh God, they murdered women and children," which actually they didn't. They were executed.
For the record, they did not murder women and children.
For the record, they were executed because they were guilty by association. Yeah. They hadn't actually done anything. But I mean, you couldn't even, but there was this mutiny history. Of course, Pakistan, it was a very colonial school. We had all these old colonial maps. And everything was pink, British Empire. I mean, there was no Pakistan, it was all India. And we were doing geography, and they said, "What are the main ports? What are the main ports in India?" So I saw this pink map. I thought, I know the answer. I put up my hand, I said, "Karachi." They said, "No, Madras." So I said, "Oh, God." So it was this kind of thing which emerges in Orientalism, and I was very aware of that.
So what did it mean for you then to read the literatures of the colonies, basically? I mean, at what point did that? Because I mean, for me, that's very. I mean, you read everything.
No, I don't. I mean, no, I didn't really seem to think the literature colony. It was just simply a literature that enjoyed, that opened out other worlds. Mind you, at school, I was a bit of an eccentric reader. I mean, all my other friends, I mean, I was always picking up books that they weren't picking up. And so obviously I was a more serious reader. The other disastrous thing, which I never told anybody, was in the school library, I found a copy of the Quran in English. And I was so excited. I didn't tell anyone, I picked it up, started reading it, and I nearly passed out. I just went, because it was written by a missionary, and it was awful, the kind of things it said. It was just unbelievable. I never told anybody, I just put it back and went away. So there were all these kind of things, these little anecdotes that you're reminding me of which I knew nothing. Yeah. I wanted to, well, I should, what are the links, if any? Because a lot of people often say to me, between autobiography and fiction, how much of your own self do you put in? Well, I don't think you do, thank God, or of family life, but, people often say, Kamila's got this character, but she doesn't sound like you. And I thought, well, no.
I mean, I'm not interested in autobiography largely because for me, a lot of the joy of writing is the invention and the making up of things. It's a process, particularly with inventing characters. There's something mysterious and interesting, and you might sometimes take an attribute from someone. So there might be a gesture that you pick up from someone, or a certain kind of phraseology from someone else. But what I did with the first 4 novels, so that's In the City by the Sea, Salt and Saffron, Cartography, and Broken Verses, I used to always say it's not at all autobiographical, but of course, I was using everything but the people was what I had grown up with. So it was a Karachi. I used to write about a Karachi that I grew up in, the neighborhoods I knew, the kinds of people and the kinds of stories that I lived with. Um, and I'm not sure we have a word for that yet, because autobiographical or not autobiographical, I think is too clean, and doesn't explain the way in which you can, take the atmosphere of a place. Um, so I sometimes think of it this way. A friend of mine once looked at photographs I'd taken. There were photographs of Karachi, and she said, "Why are there so few people in here?" Um, and she asked it in a quite rightly in a suspicious way, because of course it's an old colonial way of doing paintings, is you do just the landscape and not the people, because the people are blights. And I said, well, for me it's because when I write, I'm going to use these landscapes and these neighborhoods, but I'm going to put my characters in there. And so the photographs are kind of aid memoirs for me, or it's a way of this is the backdrop and the surrounding, and then I'm going to drop my characters in there. And for the first 4 novels, I did that, and I really, really could not imagine ever writing about anywhere else. Amir Hussain told me a wonderful story about Anita Desai when I started to write, which I used to think of a lot, where Anita Desai was talking about how she, at that stage, was going back to write about India a lot, even though she'd lived elsewhere. And then the conversation moved on, and Amir started talking about how he'd been at the home of some English friends, and there were these 2 women, English women, and one of them, and there were some strawberries there, and one of them said, "Strawberries, and the other one said, "From the garden," and the first one said, "From the garden," and the second one said, and she said, "Strawberries, and Amr said, and of course this whole conversation was a way in Pakistan be like, "These came from your garden, that's so amazing." There'd be this big thing, and there it was just strawberries, from the garden, expressed what in a Karachi drawing room would have been a much more expansive conversation. And Anita Desai said, "Oh, Amir, that's exactly it. Anywhere outside of India, I don't get the strawberries." And I thought it was a lovely way of expressing that when you grow up in a place, you know its subtexts in a particular way that is very convenient for a writer, because you can just immediately tune into that and use it. And then I started to write Burnt Shadows, which was originally going to be largely a Karachi novel. It was going to be a Karachi novel set in 1998, the summer of the nuclear tests. And in it, there would be someone, a man, I don't know why he was a man, but he was, who was from Karachi, but his grandmother was Japanese and had survived the bombing of Nagasaki. And at some point in doing this, I was thinking, who is this grandmother? And I realized that I had to write her story, which meant I would have to start in Nagasaki in 1945, which is about as far from my Karachi as you could get. And I was teaching at the time, and I used to say to my students in a throwaway kind of way, if you want to write something and the idea of it terrifies you, you have to do it. You may fail and then put it aside, but you need to at least try. And I thought, well, I keep saying this to my students, I need to do it. And so I started to write Nagasaki 1945, which was absolutely terrifying and strange, but it also taught me there is a different way of writing, which is not writing about the world you grew up in and know, but as Colin McCann said, writing not what you know, but writing towards what you want to know. And I think that's when I sort of changed as a writer for a while. And so at that point for me, the autobiographical, in terms of the context and landscape, lifts off, and then I start becoming a different kind of writer who wants to veer off.
Yes, because then you wrote about Peshawar, which you didn't really visit. You only visited once, and I've had friends from Peshawar who wanted to know if I had links to the place, you know.
Yeah.
So I thought that was really interesting. I want to go back a little bit into family history. We haven't talked much about family tales. How did your grandparents influence you? Nana, Nani, Dada. No, Dada was not around. Dadi was German.
I mean, in different ways. I think with Burnt Shadows, when you have the sort of central character of Burnt Shadows is a Japanese woman who leaves Japan in 1945 and goes to Delhi in 47 and then ends up in Pakistan. She's Japanese. My grandmother was German, but I think the fact of having had, of that same generation, a grandmother who came from somewhere else and then learned to make her life for herself in a very different place, and very much had a sort of forward-looking attitude. I'd say this of all the grandparents. I mean, they lived through partition. In the case of my dad, they lived through sort of displacement from her first home, and then, imagine being a German woman in the 30s and 40s with they see children while what is going on in Germany is going on in Germany. But there was this very forward-looking sense, which I think is very deeply there in Burnt Shadows. Because she lived in Islamabad and Murray, so we didn't see her as much. My Nana and Nani's house, again, it's that thing, when you're a child, the world you're given is what you're given, you don't think about it. I was much more aware of my grandfather's interest in literature and books and words, because my language of reading was English. And English was, this was a man who you said a word to him and he would tell you the Latin root for it. And also I loved from a very early age the Greek classics. And when I was about 12, I said, "Do you have a copy of the Odyssey?" And he said, "Well, I have it in Greek," which was no use to me. And then he said, and because when you're 12, you're stupid and you don't realize the opportunities you shouldn't be missing out on, he said, "I'll read it with you in Greek and I'll translate it for you." And I never took him up on that. But he was very aware of language. He loved language. He would sit at the table and he would say, "The greatest onomatopoeias in the world are Greek." I think my sister and I may be among the very few people who, by the age of 6, knew what an onomatopoeia was, and that the greatest ones were in Greek, according to my grandfather. And there was this one line which is of Prometheus and the rock falling down the hill, and he would say this line in Greek, and then he'd translate it as, "And so to earth once more roll down that naughty stone." And then he'd do it in Greek, and you would hear the stone, bouncing down a hill and sliding to a stop. So that awareness that language is not just meaning, but it is also music and sound. I think I first got from my grandfather, and later Agha Shahid Ali became, as a poet, was so, Shahid, the first day he walked into a classroom I was teaching, and he said, "My ambition is that by the time you leave this class, you will not be able to hear a single word without registering an emotional response to the sound of it." And I was so skeptical, and I remember thinking, will I have a response to the word "the"? And then by halfway through the term, I thought, "The, it's very dull, and is much livelier." So he worked that way. With my grandmother, there was a disconnect because her language was Urdu, and I grew up in a time in a school where the teaching of Urdu was just not in any way prioritized. And when we were taught Urdu, we weren't, again, it was Shahid who gave me fairs. I grew up during the lifetime of fairs, and I was not reading fairs in Pakistan because in schools this was considered a little too out there. Fehmida Riaz I was not reading in schools. It was later on that you realized how astonishingly vibrant Urdu literature was happening around me as I was growing up, and I was unaware of it. And so my grandmother's language, and this is a source of enormous shame to me now, but it was sort of much less interesting to me. And it was much later, I think nearer the time that I started to work on Salt and Saffron, that I realized, and this is to go back to one of your comments, that my Nani was always telling stories. She was always telling stories, and that the stories were brocaded with astonishing detail. My Nani could tell you stories. She could remember the gharara someone was wearing 40 years ago, and the color of it. But she could also, there were great stories of intrigue. And it's that thing you said earlier, that you grew up with stories. And so I think of it this way, that from my grandmother I got stories, and from my grandfather I got language.
And Uncle Yaqub taught you the translation of Hamlet.
Yes, and then my great uncle Yaqub, who spoke about 7 languages, would say things like, "Well, now the opening line of Hamlet, 'Who's there?' is actually, it's better in German." And then he would say it in German. He said, "In German it becomes an existential question of who's there. It's not just about a presence, it's not about a ghost, but this whole question of, who?" And then he'd go into these deep metaphysics and how Hamlet is different in Japanese culture because the idea of ghosts are so different. And that in Japan there are many kinds of ghosts. So if you're performing Hamlet in Japan, one of the first questions you have to answer for yourself as a director is which kind of ghost is Hamlet's father? And the kind of ghost he is the whole play rides on it because they're the malevolent ghosts and then they are not the malevolent ghosts. So again, it was a household of, or a family where books, literature, stories, all that. The question my mother won't ask me is what was the influence of having her as a mother? Um, and of course, that was enormous because, again, it wasn't until much later that I realized how few of my friends grew up in households where there were books on tap. I mean, there were bookshelves that literally my mother's bookshelves have bowed with the weight of the books. Um, and she was always taking us to the British Council Library, to the Sin Club Library. I mean, if you think of Karachi in the 80s, um, it wasn't that easy to come by English language literature. I mean, now it's a very different scene. But it was much harder then. And I used to read a novel a day, which meant I used to reread. But she made it possible for me to just read all the time. And it wasn't until I was much later that I learned this secret that she had kept from me, she and my father, that there's a certain point in the life of a young woman, say when she's 12 or 13, where she starts to read a certain kind of novel. In my days, many years later, I discovered that my parents had had a conversation, said, this doesn't seem entirely appropriate. What do we do? And they did the wisest thing possible, which is to decide you never tell someone, do not read that book, that this is the wrong thing to say. So instead, she started to hand me other kinds of books. And there was a certain point where my mother was handing me, as I said, Anita Desai, Atiya Hussain, Kazuo Ishiguro. And so for a while, I was sort of, sometimes you're in a Jackie Collins mood, and sometimes you're in a Kazuo Ishiguro mood. And I suspect my novels show these two things. And then gradually, you start to see that actually you want more Kazuo Ishiguro in your life. But also, I think it was so important to have a mother who wrote, and that was something that within the household was respected. And for that, of course, my father gets a lot of credit, that it wasn't, I think that a lot of people, particularly in Pakistan, feel that writing might be a secret thing you do on the side when, but not that it can be a centrally important thing. And my mother had a writing study, and she wrote, and it was a serious thing that everyone took seriously, but we also knew that at any point we could come in and say, Mama, I need to go for netball practice. And sometimes you'd have to repeat it 5 times because she's so deep in her work that she doesn't hear, but it's never that you can't ask the question. And so the idea that you could have, that I remember reading Virginia Woolf, again when I was about 16 or 17, A Room of One's Own, where she talks about the importance for a woman writer to have a room of one's own, a place where you are there to write. And it's understood that writing is a serious thing. My mother had a room of her own. And therefore, I understood that you can do that. And it was much, much later, again, the number of Pakistani women I meet who are younger, who simply don't grow up in an environment where it is believed that your intellectual work is serious and should be taken seriously. And all these things she's talking about, so growing up in a world where writing should, from people of South Asia is seen as a bit suspect or not really literature. I never had that because of my mother and the times I was growing up in, but because of my mother. I never had the sense that writing isn't something serious. I never had the sense that writing isn't something a woman can do. So I had it much easier. I mean, she had to do all the firsts in some ways, and I just got to be in the slipstream.
Well, the plus side of that is I've given credit to your father because when I was newly married, I didn't know what to do. Everybody else was going to coffee parties, and he said, "Do what you like." And then when he discovered I was actually serious, I got interested in writing. He actually bought me a typewriter, and that got me going. My handwriting is very useless.
Very useless.
Yes.
Can we? I know we should open up soon. Can we talk a little about your mother as a writer?
Well, I did want to talk about that, yes, just before we open up.
Yeah.
So, well, my mother became a published writer at the age of 84. She wrote her memoirs when my father was sick, and her sister said to her, "You've had a very good life. Why don't you write about it?" So Mummy sat down to write about her life. What she wrote it in Urdu. Then it was later translation. And it's called Zindagi Ki Yaadein, Riyasat Rampur Ka Nawabi Daur. She grew up in the princely state of Rampur. And we're bringing out a second edition, OUP is bringing out a second edition quite soon. And what she did in that, it was a bit of family history, but she wrote about the culture and the customs and the food and the different kind of ghararas that were sewn and the different kind of embroidery that was done and all that she interwove with her own life. And she basically, because there is a tradition which was not mentioned, we have a very long tradition of writing memoirs to be passed on to family, not necessarily published. So she was encouraged by her friends, Begum Ikramullah, Shanul Haq Haqqi, who also edited some of it. And then she just wrote it in Urdu and gave it to Amina Sayyed and said, Beta, tum bhi pad lo. And Amina had it read and said, oh, this is very interesting. They didn't have an Urdu program, so it was published in an English translation first. And then it came out in an Urdu translation. And now we've done a new edition in which Kamila has written a little bit about her. We've got a scholar who's done, Razak Khan, who's done work on Rampur, and he's done. And what was interesting that when she passed away, in her desk, not only did I find, although mother didn't cook, daddy cooked, masses of recipes, but also a book of poems. It was called, Amir told me this, I showed it to Amir, it's called a bayaz, where because she used to play bait bazi with a friend, where she had jotted down poems she liked. And these poems are extraordinary because she's not only got Mir and Ghalib and Parveen Shakir and Ada Jafri and all, she's got my khala, Rafat Zamani Begum of Rampur, who I now discover wrote under the pen name of Azmat. She's got poems by her ancestor, Nana Bashiruddin Mirza. She's even got a poem, which is by Ghalib, which is not in any of his divans. So I then got Fatima Hassan at Amir said, you get a proper scholar to write on it. So Fatima Hassan has done a very nice piece on it. And inshallah, that is going to come out, I hope, this year.
One of the very last conversations I had with my Nani was, and I think, again, your memory will tell me that it was the very last conversation I had with her before she died. It was certainly close to that because the book, it was about to be her book launch. You know, she died the night, 2 nights before.
She died a week before her.
She died a week before her book launch. So the book launch became a memorial. And one of the last conversations we had, she said to me, we are both writers now.
Oh, she was very proud of becoming a writer. So, can we?
And I think we have about 10 minutes for questions.
Yes.
In the front here, the lady here, and then the gentleman in the back there. Yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Kamla.
Hello.
This question is on behalf of my brother who finished reading Burnt Shadows last year.
Mm-hmm.
He happens to be married to a Japanese lady for almost 49 years.
Mm-hmm.
And he's been to both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And he was wondering what is the source or inspiration of of your character, the Japanese character. Yeah.
I mean, Burnt Shadows, as I said, started for me with Pakistan. And so it started with the nuclear tests in 98. And if you recall, there were those few days, India tested its nuclear bomb, and there were a few days before Pakistan did. And I remember reading a news article that a group of Hibakusha, which is the survivors of the atom bomb from Japan, came to Islamabad to plead with the Pakistani government to not
do it. Yeah.
And I remember being very struck by that story and thinking, what must it be like to be, sort of it's 50 years since the bomb. And the Cold War is over, so maybe you think that threat has receded and suddenly in your continent, this comes up again. So that activated a memory of when I was an undergraduate, and I remember being at a talk, and I wish I could remember who was doing the talk, but it was someone who was talking about American foreign policy and aggression, and said, imagine, he said, people always talk about Hiroshima, but the greater crime was Nagasaki, because imagine doing that, what they did in Hiroshima, seeing the aerial footage of that devastation, and knowing that the emperor will now give up the war. and 3 days later doing it again. And I remember just being struck by that there's something about the particular horror of what nations do to each other. In that second bombing, that decision of we've done that, we will do it again. So that had stuck in my head, and then it became a Pakistan story for me. And there was the Kara Film Festival used to be on at the time, and someone had done, and again, I wish I remembered who it was. I'm sure Hassan Zaidi will know. There was a short film where someone had taken scenes in Karachi and around Pakistan, maybe all around, maybe Pakistan and India, and sort of imagine what they would look like if a nuclear bomb fell and sort of the devastation. There were literally these visual images, and it was so horrifying to me that then the novel came out of that.
Okay, thank you so much.
The gentleman in the blue shirt back there.
Hello. In one of your interviews, you said that writing is a muscle. You must use it, you must keep using it. So, what are you thinking nowadays in this age of artificial intelligence and a lot of violence and intolerance? And what next is coming from you? Thank you.
So that was a line from Akia Hussain, who we could do an entire session on what it means to have someone like that in the family. When I was 11 years old, we'd gone to London, and my mother told Atya, Kamila wants to be a writer. And Atya pulled me to a side very seriously and said, whatever you do, and no matter how well or badly your books do or what anyone says, do not stop writing, because it's a muscle, and if you stop using it, you lose it. I know, because I lost it. Which I've always remembered, and I always tell my students and anyone else. You know, I don't know which way AI will go. I think we're very complacent that it can't replace human creativity. I think it'll quickly replace the lower end of human creativity. There's a lot of stuff that's written that is very formulaic. Artificial intelligence is going to replace that right away. I don't think artificial intelligence can give us a Michael Ondaatje or a Nadeem Aslam or a Ali Smith. These are some of my favorite writers. But I think it'll be doing a lot more than at the moment we're complacently thinking it will. I think a lot of TV shows are going to be written by AI very, very soon, at the lower end of things. So then there may just be a divide between, AI content and that certain kind of magic that requires people to be almost genius-like. As for what I'm writing now, well, I'm writing it, so I'm trying to figure out what it is. And hopefully by late next year, it'll be out in the world. And one more question. I think there was one gentleman there.
Hi, ma'am. My question is basically what will you give the advice to the youngsters who became a writer?
Do you have advice for young people wanting to be writers?
Well, just write.
Just write.
Just write, and don't worry about getting published. I'm always a little wary of parents who publish their children at 12 or 13. I mean, it's okay, but I think it puts pressure on them. Just let them write till they develop, and not only write. If you want to write, read. That's how you learn. Babsi learned by reading. She read and she read and she read. She taught by herself, and actually that's what I did. I just read. And I used to, in those days, by the way, when I used to go to England, I used to have a big box. I used to go to the Hatchards, I think that shops. I used to have a big box of books, and I used to have them posted by sea. They used to take 3-4 months to get here. But they would come here unharmed. Now I don't know if they do. But reading is the answer. Reading, and you just write.
I think the important thing is not to keep saying, I'll do it when I have time.
Yeah.
You'll never have time. You have to make the time. And that's easier for some people than for others. There are a lot of people who simply don't have the hours in the day, and I recognize that. But I also know of people. There was one of my professors at university. She had a full-time professing job, and she had 2 children aged 2 and 4. So she would wake up at 4 a.m. And she said, I have an hour and a half before my children wake up. And every day I write for that hour and a half. And I think, There's a great line. Abdul Razak Gurnah, the Nobel Prize winner, was asked, in fact, last week at a conference, well, what do you do how do you write if you can't write, if you feel you're not doing it? And he just said, if you're going to write, write. And if you're not going to write, no one's life depends on you writing. You're not a surgeon. You're not even a plumber. And so if you don't write another book, it won't matter to anyone but you. And I think that it sort of sounds facile, but I think he's also saying it has to be self-driven. You have to. I'm now in a position where it is my job, it is my livelihood. But for everyone, at some point, you're starting off and you're simply writing blind. You're writing without knowing if anyone will ever publish it or reading it. But you just really want to.
I just want to suddenly it came to me. We've been talking about English because we are both Anglophone, but we have a very strong tradition of Urdu writing in our family. And although we live in a society where there's always this Urdu-English debate, what I loved was that the Urdu writers in our family were just so happy that we were into literature. And they gave us, Jamiluddin Ali gave me a signed copy of his book. Shanul Haq Haqqi, who's a friend rather than relative, he gave his dictionary signed to Kamila. My aunt Hamida Sultan Begum from Delhi came, put her arms around me, signed her books to me. So it's rather wonderful that this language divide actually doesn't exist in that way among people who love literature.
I think that's a good note on which to end. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I don't know how this goes off, but